I'm not surprised.
Nate Diaz!
Yeah, no, I'm sturdy like a milli rocket. Skin clear, still look young. I need million money in my pocket. Don't call me a money pocket. Just get to rocket. It sound like a thunder rocket. Yeah, I still love my baby even when...
Nate Diaz is often accused of carrying himself like a punk from the hood, but upon a deeper dive into his story of passion, perseverance, and determination, one will find out why he's one of the most intriguing personalities in combat sports. Forget about his patchy MMA record for a second. Diaz is as a fighter should be. He speaks his mind whether you like it or not.
So you can't talk like that on Fox!
He isn't afraid to take risks, and he doesn't like playing around. And he's an entertainer inside the cage thanks to his badass fighting style. UFC purists respect Nate Diaz as an old-school fighter who doesn't care about records and won't think twice before slapping you in the face if you mess around. And casuals see him as one of the kingpins of mixed martial arts. Neither is wrong. Join us as we take a closer look at the life and career of one of MMA's biggest, baddest, and meanest names, Nathan Donald Diaz. Nate and his elder brother Nick Diaz come from a humble background, and from a young age, they were made to fight for everything they've achieved in their lives, which is why they're always ready to throw down. Growing up in Stockton, California, where violence was the order of the day, life was harder for Diaz and his family compared to others because they were one of the poorest residents in their locality who struggled to make ends meet. Owing to the family's financial troubles, Nick, the older of the two, started training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and Nate followed to help them navigate through the hardships of life. Unlike Nick, who was more determined to achieve big things in martial arts, Nate wasn't very interested in BJJ. He wasn't particularly good at it either, and he only tagged along with his elder brother because the older guys in the class would buy him a burrito from the food truck that pulled up near the gym each night. Before he knew it, Nate fell in love with BJJ because it brought him happiness. The constant grind on the mats released endorphins that briefly made Nate forget about his family's issues, which would often leave him angry and hopeless. A few years later, Nick Diaz would enter the world of professional mixed martial arts, and Nate would eventually follow. Diaz made a successful start to his mixed martial arts career by submitting his opponent in the third round. He won 3 out of his next 4 fights and earned a shot at the World Extreme Cage Fighting Lightweight Championship in 2006 against Hermes Franca, a veteran with over 20 MMA fights. Diaz was still very young, with 5 wins and a loss in MMA, and Franca was far more skilled at the time. To make matters worse, WEC decided to make a few last-minute rule changes that didn't favor Nate. That's when Nick Diaz stepped in and negotiated a bigger payday for his brother as compensation for changes that weren't agreed upon. Nate kept a straight face throughout the last-minute negotiations between WEC and his brother, but he was bursting inside with happiness at the thought of buying a house for himself with his money. For a kid who didn't have the money to buy a burrito a few years ago, $12,000 was a big deal. And although Diaz lost to Franca by submission, he learned an important lesson. He was worth his weight in gold. After losing to Franca, Diaz parted ways with WEC and won the Ultimate Fighter Season 5 to earn his ticket to the UFC. In his first 4 fights in the promotion, Diaz won his first 3 by submission, announcing himself as a legitimate contender. Nate's win against Kurt Pellegrino especially was iconic. A BJJ black belt with world-class wrestling, Pellegrino was considered a bad matchup for Diaz, but he ended up being one of Diaz's career highlights. As Pellegrino went for a takedown, the two landed in a way that allowed Nate to lock a tight triangle choke. Normally, fighters would use their hands to pull their opponent's heads further down into the choke, but Diaz laid back, gave a double bicep flex, and flipped his opponent off until he tapped. If there's anything that sums up the Nate Diaz experience perfectly, it's this particular fight. But the Stockton native continued to produce iconic and jaw-dropping moments for years to come after that as well. After winning his first 4 fights in the UFC, Diaz lost twice to Clay Guida by split and Joe Stevenson by unanimous decision. But even in defeats, he earned Fight of the Night honors. In fact, Nate secured 5 bonuses in his first 6 fights in the UFC. And like his brother Nick, he was starting to be recognized for his toughness, his unbreakable will, and his incredible fighting spirit. In the next 3 UFC fights, fights, Nate Diaz won twice before causing one of the biggest and most shocking brawls in MMA history at a Strikeforce event in April 2010. The infamous Nashville Brawl between Jason Mayhem Miller and Jake Shields with Nick and Nate remains the biggest black eye in the sport's history. After Shields defeated Dan Henderson to retain the Strikeforce middleweight title, Miller entered the cage and interrupted his post-fight interview to demand a rematch. Shields' teammates, including the Diaz brothers and Gilbert Melendez, jumped Miller, and within moments, chaos ensued. The Nashville Brawl was proof that the Diaz bros don't play around, and when they sense disrespect or danger, they'll attack without thinking twice. Nate especially doesn't like being friendly with his opponents, and Donald "Cowboy" Cerrone learned it the hard way heading into their fight a year after the Strikeforce Brawl. Diaz had bounced back from a 2-fight losing streak a few months prior to fighting Cerrone, so his confidence was pretty high. Cerrone wanted to have a good relationship with another recognizable name in MMA, and he even offered to shake Diaz's hand at an open workout, but the latter slapped his hand away, called him a punk ass, and walked away. From there on, there was a lot of bad blood between the two, with Diaz slapping off his cowboy hat during a pre-fight face-off and flipping him off numerous times during their one-sided battle at UFC 141 in 2011. Diaz was on song that night, and his boxing was beyond perfect. Cerrone had no answer to his opponent's superior skill set, especially with a broken jaw, and Diaz added insult to injury by giving him the finger in between rounds. It was arguably one of the greatest performances of the Mexican-American's career. In his next fight, Diaz added another feather to his cap by submitting a grappling wizard in Jim Miller in 2012. Miller was the favorite because of his grappling credentials, but Diaz proved that Cesar Gracie doesn't hand out black belts for no reason when he won by submission in the second round. The win earned Diaz his first lightweight title shot against Benson Henderson in 2012, but he was dominated by the champion before being finished for the first time in his career by Josh Thomson, who hurt him with a vicious head kick and followed up with an avalanche of strikes on the mat until his corner decided to throw in the towel. In 2015, Diaz caused another infamous brawl at a World Series of Fighting event. According to him, Khabib Nurmagomedov was there with his team of 12 Dagestani men, who literally started picking on him. Since Diaz doesn't like messing around, he responded by slapping Khabib, and naturally, a fight ensued, but the two sides were quickly dispersed. Diaz was kicked out of Planet Hollywood in Las Vegas, but being the badass fighter that he is, he claimed that he waited for Khabib outside the arena. The Russian didn't show up, however. A few months later, Nate Diaz earned the biggest opportunity of his mixed martial arts career when he was asked to step in on short notice to fight Conor McGregor, who was expected to fight Rafael dos Anjos for the light heavyweight title, but the Brazilian pulled out due to injury. The fight was a non-title welterweight bout, and having not lost in his UFC career, McGregor was a heavy favorite. The two fought in a blockbuster main event at UFC 196, where McGregor started off with a bang, dropping Nate twice but failing to finish him. McGregor landed one big left hand after another, and although Diaz would go down, he wouldn't go out. By the end of the second round, it was all McGregor, but because he had expended a lot of energy in trying to finish Diaz off, he looked fatigued in the second round. McGregor started the second round pretty well, but Diaz started to fire back and hurt him, forcing McGregor to grab a hold of his legs. Diaz quickly countered, took the Irishman's back, and submitted him with a rear naked choke. The reactions in MGM Grand Arena in Las Vegas were mixed. A few fans erupted in joy, while most either had their mouths wide open or had their hands on their heads. No one saw it coming. Diaz's win was monumental, but his post-fight interview was even better. Anyone else would have gone bonkers after pulling off a win of that magnitude, but Diaz was cool as ice, telling Joe Rogan that he wasn't surprised.
Hey, I'm not surprised.
Having suffered an embarrassing defeat at the hands of Diaz, McGregor demanded an immediate rematch instead of a lightweight title shot at the same weight and under the same terms and conditions. Diaz obliged, and the two locked horns at UFC 202 in a barn burner. McGregor had the edge in the opening rounds, while the final three were pretty close, with many believing that Diaz had done enough to earn the victory. Instead, McGregor was declared the winner by majority decision. Prior to his fights against McGregor, Nate was his brother's sidekick, but after making making McGregor taste defeat and adversity, he turned into a superstar who earned big money and did big pay-per-view numbers without the Irishman. With millions in his bank, Diaz didn't fight for nearly 3 years, from 2016 to 2019. His brother Nick Diaz's suspension due to marijuana had something to do with his decision as well.
Not just money now, but the right to stand up for not only what I believe in, but for my little brother. I can't even go and help my little brother.
Eventually, Nate made his return in 2019 and sparked a joint at the UFC 241 Open workouts before battering Anthony Pettis for 3 rounds. In his next 2 fights, Diaz lost to Jorge Masvidal in their famous BMF title fight and Leon Edwards in 2019 and 2021 respectively. Behind all the violence and chaos is a heart that's filled with goodness, and Diaz showed a tiny glimpse of his kind-heartedness by helping a fan who lost his rent money betting on him against Masvidal. Against Leon Edwards, he was dominated for nearly 5 rounds until he rocked the Brit in the dying seconds of the fight. But instead of going for the kill, he opted to mock Rocky. That was Nate Diaz in a nutshell. Diaz's final fight on his UFC contract was supposed to be against Khamzat Chimaev at UFC 279 in 2022. Many believed it was the UFC's way of punishing one of its most loyal employees over a contractual dispute, and a means to promote Chimaev at Diaz's expense. Fighting gods had other plans, however. Chimaev would eventually pull out and get demoted to the co-main event after missing the welterweight limit by 7 pounds. Diaz would then face Tony Ferguson, submit him in the 4th round, and cap off a glorious UFC career with his trademark muscle flex after the tap. Diaz may still make his return to the UFC once he's done exploring new avenues in boxing, but wherever he decides to go, one thing is guaranteed: he'll never back down from any challenge that's put in front of him. And whether he wins or loses, he's going to keep making his fans live the Nate Diaz experience. Where do you rank Nate Diaz among the most influential fighters of all time? Give us your thoughts in the comments section below. If you liked our video, please subscribe to our channel and turn on the notifications so we keep bringing you the stories that you love. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.